Hello, everyone seeing us on the virtual screen, and I welcome you all to the PharmaPulse, the show where we decode the entire drug life cycle with the people who actually live it. So, in this series of podcasts, we'll be having 8 episodes this season, and we are going to go deep on every single part of the pharma value chain: the discovery, the clinical trials, the regulatory submissions, medical affairs, market access, and the real client stories from the front line. So today is our kickoff, and I've got the perfect person to set the stage, Mr. Tony Williams, who is a country manager for USA for Ingenious eBrain and has spent more than 17 years at the intersection of pharma and technology. So, Tony, welcome to the show, and I'll give it to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for welcoming me. Yes, my name is Dr. Tony Williams, and I'm a UK-trained physician, and I've been working in drug development, all phases, for quite a long while. So I'm very happy to be on this program and to answer some of the questions and describe my experiences.
Thank you, Tony. So, for our guest, before we get into what Ingenious eBrain does specifically, I want to start somewhere really basic because I think a lot of people, even smart people outside the industry, genuinely do not understand what the pharma value chain actually means. So, Tony, can you draw it for me metaphorically on a napkin that what is a pharma value chain?
It's the entire drug development process, all the way from the initial drug discovery and then into the requisite animal studies, the requisite toxicology studies, and then into the clinical studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, hopefully getting the product approved. And then there is more to it, because having an approved product is not the end of the process, because it takes a lot of work to launch a drug, and I've launched 3 in my time. And it takes a lot of work to get things like pricing right, to get things like promotion right, to get it established within a market, to make it a success. And I think people sometimes look at just individual parts of this chain and forget that there is quite a lot that's gone before, and there's quite a lot that's going to happen afterwards.
And Tony, in the entire process that you mentioned, clinical trials, phase 1, 2, 3, and then the studies on the animal, where do you think the data and technology sits in all of that?
That's a very good question, because we are drowning in data these days, as we know. And the introduction of basically computerized databases for data collection has in some ways made the process more difficult. And one of the reasons why we are here in Ingenious is because we want to try and simplify this interaction between collecting the data, producing the reports, and going to the various regulatory authorities, and then successful launch of the drug. So this is what we do.
Exactly. So I think now we have answered what Ingenious is doing in the industry exactly. We are helping the clients with how you design a trial, how you submit evidence to the regulators, how you make the case to payers, and it's all the data. So I think that's where we help our clients do better.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So
Okay.
with that, Tony, I think with that introduction, we come on to our next segment. It's known as the myth busting segment, where I want to play a very quick game with you, and I'm going to say things that people commonly believe about the pharma. And you tell me whether it's true, false, or it's complicated. So
Okay.
are you ready? Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
All
Quick
right.
fire round.
All right. So the first question for you here is that the pharma companies just buy up research from universities and then slap a price tag on it.
Well, that would be great if it actually happened. But the reality is, actually finding products from universities can be very tricky. I used to do quite a lot of work when I was in Texas with one of the cancer institutes there. And it's never quite as simple as pharma comes in and says, give us your research, we're going to give you some money, and then that's it. Because after that process, you have the preclinical section to get done, which is generally not done in universities, or it's not done as well as the FDA wants it. And then you've got to do the entire clinical development, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and you have to collect all that data at the same time. You have to develop protocols for the indication that you're going to go for, and the protocols have to be approved by the FDA. And if they're not approved by the FDA, you do not do clinical research. So think of it more as a relay, and there are various runners in a relay, and everyone has to hand over the baton and not drop it, because once you drop it, you lose years off the development cycle. And as I keep pointing out, all these drugs that we develop have got patent lives, and they're not infinite. And so it's important to make sure that every stage of the process is properly controlled and makes sense.
So we'll be classifying it as a complicated myth.
Yes, complicated.
Great. So with that, we come to our second myth about the industry. That's the FDA just rubber stamps whatever the pharma submits.
No, the FDA is a very rigorous organization that's answerable to the US government, so they are very careful about how the process works. In other words, there is a lot of interaction, even more so these days than it used to be when I first started off, because we've got electronic messaging, and the reviewers at FDA can ask very pointed questions like, why are you doing this particular patient group? We can't see that there's an indication, and we want you to think again. To give you an example, the first stage in the clinical development process is the submission of the IND, which, if you don't get a call back from the FDA within 30 days, means you can actually start the study. Normally, however, we get calls back because the reviewers want to understand what it is we're doing. And so there's a lot of interaction. So the FDA is not a rubber stamp at all. It's a very interactive, and it's quite a fascinating process. And some of the medical reviewers who work there, are extremely bright and very well organized.
So the another myth is related to the second. And the third myth goes like that once a drug is approved by the FDA, the hard part is over.
No, it's not, because you still have to do launch, you have to do market access. It's very rare these days that a drug gets approved without some stipulations as to what other studies need to be done. And this might include pediatric indications. This might include doing what to do if something goes wrong, And it also involves a lot of pharmacovigilance because, an average drug may be exposed to about 1,000 patients during the course of its clinical development. But if you're going to treat millions of people, you need to be very careful that you're seeing exactly what's happening in the field in a real-world situation. Clinical trials are artificial in as much as the people running them are observed, they're monitored. People go in and they monitor what's going on to make sure that the protocol's being followed. The moment it gets into the market, that's the moment then people can start getting creative, shall we say. And that's why we need to do pharmacovigilance and why the FDA is very keen on getting reports sent to them so they know what's going on. Because again, it's perfectly possible, and there have been examples in the past of a drug that looks perfectly fine in clinical studies, and then you suddenly start finding that there's a 1 in 10,000 rare and deadly side effect, which is why the FDA is keen on pharmacovigilance.
Absolutely. And with that, we come to our last myth, the biggest myth around the industry.
So you were about to ask me about
the last question.
Does the pharma industry care about patients? And the answer is yes, very much so. Patients represent the people who are going to be essentially buying the drugs, whether it's via their insurance or the National Health Service or whatever. And the individual in a team, some of these scientists have spent 15 years trying to get a concept which they hope is going to benefit people into the clinic. And to fail at the last moment is very demoralizing for the teams. So I would say, yes, pharma is interested in the patients. We certainly, in my experience, I've worked very closely with patient groups, such as the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the USA, to make sure that the patients understand what we're doing, because when we go and start giving them new experimental drugs, they do need reassurance that we know what we're doing, which we do. So there was a great deal of care that we take in pharma to make sure that the patients and the patient representatives understand what the process is and where we are in the process.
So, Tony, with this myth-busting segment is over. And before I conclude this segment, I think we've answered a couple of major questions around the industry, about the pharmaceutical industries and how the companies are operating on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
With that, the another question for you on the table is that when we came up with the idea of this podcast, what was the gap Team Ingenious was hoping to fill? What is the agenda behind this podcast?
The agenda is to persuade people, if they don't already know this, that companies such as Ingenious can help them at every stage of drug development to help corral the clinical data, to make sure it's in the right place, and to make sure that the studies are run in an expeditious fashion and that there aren't any shortcuts being taken. Big Pharma is obviously very good because they have big teams. They can do almost everything in-house. Biotech tend to have very, very small and relatively young teams. And this is where I think our skill sets can come in, because we see a lot of data simultaneously with very many projects, and we actually understand what can go wrong. And I think we can help to make sure that nothing nothing really does go wrong, simply because the originating team may not have actually done this before. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. And I think we talk to the pharma companies every day, and what we keep seeing is a knowledge gap between the commercial teams and the clinical teams, between the data scientists and the medical affairs people, between the leadership and the operational folks on the ground. So everyone is expert in their slice of the chain. Very few people understand the whole thing. And this podcast is our attempt to build that bridge for people inside the industry, for our smart outsiders who want to understand where their medicines come from.
Yes, absolutely.
So with that, I just want to give a little preview of this entire podcast series. So let me tease what's coming in this season, because I want listeners to know what they have signed up for. So episode 2, we are going deep on drug discovery and preclinical research. Episode 3 is clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3. It will be a very big and a major episode. Episode 4 will be around regulatory, the submission process, the FDA, the EMA. How intimidating should people find this? And then the medical affairs in episode 5, market access in episode 6, and then a full client story anthology in 7, and a future of pharma final in 8. I'm excited for the series. And Tony, just tell me one thing that surprised you when you started learning about any of these areas in your career.
I think one of the things, I started off as a laboratory scientist in London and working on antibiotics, working on MRSAs, which is a major public health problem everywhere. And one of the things I didn't really understand was the effect of pharmacokinetics on drugs. Now, pharmacokinetics, as opposed to pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics is what the body does to the drug. In other words, the drug I was working on, 𝗘𝗽𝗶𝗀𝗵, had a half-life which was originally thought to be 48 hours, and by the time we finished, it had a half-life which is essentially a month. And that's important to actually understand, because you can't begin to sensibly dose unless you understand how long the drug is going to be in the body and where in the body it is. It's all well and good to say it's in the bloodstream, but if you're treating osteomyelitis, you really need to think about what's going on in the bone or the infective tissue. And I think that is important. And I think we tend to forget that. We think it's straightforward. We can just scale up from animal studies. But the reality is we can't. We do need to do good phase 1 pharmacokinetic studies to understand what the body does to the drug and what the potential interactions are with other drugs. And again, one looks at the liver in particular, because there can be some very subtle interactions between a drug that you may be taking and a new drug. And it's important to actually understand that.
Absolutely, Tony. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And with that, we are moving towards closing out the first episode. But before I close out the first episode, a quick fire to close out. I'll be questioning you a few questions, and in this segment, you have to answer as quick as you can. So it's a rapid
Okay.
fire round. So starting with my first question for you is your favorite word in pharma that nobody outside the industry understands.
Okay, and I have to do this really quickly. I don't think people really understand how difficult a clinical study is, whether it's phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. They are very difficult to organize. They're very difficult to make happen. They need an awful lot of control, and it does need people to go and see what's going on at the hospitals or the clinics. I don't think it can be done remotely. And I know we've tried after COVID, but I think unless someone goes and looks at what's going on, you've got no idea what's actually going on.
One thing about the pharma industry, Tony, that you think is genuinely broken and it needs to change now.
Yeah, I think what's broken, and I mentioned this in the last question, I think there's a belief that everything can be done remotely. And I don't think that's the case. I think people actually have to physically go meet the physicians and the nurses and the clinical trial coordinators to find out what's going on the ground. It's all well and good to say, yes, we're going to go to, for example, a cancer institute, and they're great and they're respected by the NCI. But unless you actually go and find out what's going on, you don't really know. And then you get data coming in vast quantities that no one really understands. And then you get results which, when you get to an advisory committee in Washington and some physician says, I don't believe these patients, you've just spent 10 years essentially, and you haven't got a product and you've let down the patients. And that is always unforgivable as far as I'm concerned. We should not let our patients down.
I will take that, Tony, from you. And I think that is a perfect note to end on. So, Tony, thank you for kicking us off. Before I let you go, just one last question. Where can the listeners connect with Ingenious eBrain?
On the website.
I think we'll be mentioning our website, LinkedIn, and all the relevant links on this podcast series. And next week on the PharmaPulse, we go into laboratory, drug discovery, preclinical research, and the role of AI in finding the medicines of the future. So don't miss it. I am Ananya Shukla and see you in episode 2.